So good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share my research with you. This is a joint effort with Juanita González Uribe from London School of Economics and Edgar Causel from Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. The title of our research is actually a question that we pose to entrepreneurs about whether it's better to flee from freedom. So what we look at is the effects of structured accountability on new venture performance. And I want to thank especially the support from Nesta through their IGL program and Kauffman Foundation, and also the National Agency for Research and Development of Chile, and of course Startup Chile for being willing to conduct the experiment in their program. Many times we talk about research projects as children, so I think it's fair to use the old saying that it takes a village to raise a child, and I want to thank that village, all these people who made this possible. This has been a long, ongoing project that started even before March 2016, and so many people have been there to support this, to have the flexibility, the perseverance, and the effort to make this happen. So a big thank you to so many people. So what is our research question? So we broadly want to address this topic, which is how does supervision affect new venture performance? So you can think about this from the perspective of boards of directors and public funding agencies. But our research question or research specifically focuses on how structured accountability affects entrepreneurial outcomes. And I want you to pay close attention to these two questions because this is in effect our treatment. And so keep this in mind as we go forward in this presentation. So we ask treated entrepreneurs the following two questions once a month. What would you say are the key strategic tasks you need to work on until your next meeting? And what was your progress on the committed tasks since the last meeting? Now, why is this question even relevant? And I would like to think about four dimensions. We have decision makers, new ventures, business accelerators, and policymakers. So let's think first of decision makers and start with the individual level of analysis. So on the positive side, prior literature shows and suggests that accountability, which is this expectation that one may be called on to justify one's beliefs, feelings, and actions to others, actually does help for certain things. And it's prescribed as a tool to debias decisions, right? Because it helps us to make more systematic decision making, or decreases overconfidence because we have to think through about what we're committing to. And it also appears to help make fewer sunk cost errors. But on the flip side, we also know that entrepreneurs are biased towards independence. They like to not have to report to an authority structure. So there's this tension between these two phenomena that I think is worth exploring a little bit more. Now let's move on to the second dimension and up to one higher level of analysis, which is new ventures. And we know that boards of directors are important for the outcome of the companies that they supervise. So having a board appears to influence new venture performance positively because they're a source of advice. But there are boundary conditions, and we know that venture CEOs don't always find board advice valuable, which is kind of consistent with the previous slide about the desire for independence of board members, of entrepreneurs. But again, on the flip side, we also know that autonomy is better under uncertainty. And prior literature has found that supervising or having these accountability structures during the exploratory phases of startups actually hinders learning. It reduces the ability to change or switch based on the new information that is acquired. And we know that in particular tech startups are fraught with uncertainty and ambiguous goals. So think about it this way. Imagine a founder has decided to make certain execute certain tasks with a supervisor or a board, and 3 days later or 4 days later, that uncertainty is reduced because that founder has learned some new things, and those things that that founder has learned makes him or her realize that the tasks that he or she committed to don't make much sense anymore. So then that entrepreneur is now found, it has a dilemma, which is, do I execute the tasks that I committed to do in front of my authority figure, or should I ignore that because now I know that those tasks are useless? So again, there's this tension that we're not really clear about how they should work. Now let me move to the third dimension, which has to do with business accelerators. So prior literature, and I build on my work with Juanita González Uribe, where we looked at business accelerators as schools for entrepreneurship, and how this entrepreneurship schooling actually increases new venture performance by endowing participants with what we call entrepreneurial capital. So in the same way that business schools endow people with managerial capital so that those people can exploit the existing companies more efficiently, what we argue is that business accelerators endow people with entrepreneurial capital that helps people explore more effectively and capture the opportunities that are more valuable. Now, in this study, we treated business accelerators as a black box and found that this black box actually helps drive performance. But we wanted to unpack this black box, and we speculated that there are different mechanisms, and one of those mechanisms could be structured accountability. So this current project aims at identifying the effects of that specific mechanism a little bit more clearly. And then let me finish with this fourth dimension, which is policymakers. And policymakers here have, especially innovation and entrepreneurship policymakers, have two stakeholders. They have taxpayers on one hand and new ventures on the other. So we know that providing resources and money to new ventures reduces market friction, so that's a good thing. But on the other hand, these taxpayers want to make policymakers accountable for the use of the resources. So that kind of puts policymakers in a position where they should be supervising, or it is expected that they supervise grantees, so as to make sure that the grantees execute in accordance to what they promised they would do. So imagine a startup applies and says, I want the funding to do X, Y, and Z, and therefore, what if once the startup is granted that funding, the startup realizes that it wants to do something different? Should that be allowed? Would taxpayers be satisfied with such a change in the rules of the game to some degree? So, it potentially puts policymakers in a complicated situation. So there are three possibilities for structured accountability. If structured accountability actually increases performance, then that's great for policymakers, because that way they can address their two stakeholders effectively, right? But if, on the contrary, structured accountability were to hinder performance, then that would be a potentially bad thing, because on one hand, you want to give out resources, but on the other hand, you need to supervise whether those resources are being used according to plan, and if that supervision is actually neutralizing the positive effects of giving out the money, then might as well perhaps just not do anything, right? Why waste those resources in the first place? Now, however, there's the third possibility, that structured accountability is actually useless, right? And that's not as bad as it hindering performance. But if it is useless, then it is also good to know, because why would we spend resources in executing that structured accountability? It requires people, time, effort. So if it is useless, then again, perhaps better not to do it. So let me jump into the summary of our research. In our view, the experiment was implemented correctly. We can see this based on the implementation of our key performance indicators. We had a troupe of scribes, and we participated in every single meeting and took copious notes and detailed accounts of how each intervention occurred. We also conducted a manipulation check and find that participants do perceive the intervention to have occurred, and so treated participants recognize and feel that they had something that control group participants don't recognize. And then we also conducted in-depth interviews that confirm the same thing. Now, our measures of at least short-term performance, average treatment effects, show no differences between treatment and control groups. So that kind of poses some questions that we're still trying to explore. Is it because we need to look at longer-term effects, or are there heterogeneous treatment effects? And then finally, our in-depth interviews appear to shed a positive light on structured accountability. It appears that participants appreciate structured accountability, even though they find it onerous. And it also appears to increase the perception of value of the program. And we'll talk about these things towards the end of the discussion section. So let me talk briefly about the research setting. This is the program, Startup Chile. It's an ecosystem accelerator. Roughly 500 applicants apply to this program every 6 months. Roughly 75 of these participants get selected. Once they're selected and they go into the 6-month program, they are given $30,000 to execute their project, co-working space, and entrepreneurship schooling. So we analyze 5 cohorts and conduct this experiment with 361 participants. Now let me talk a little bit about the experimental scaffolding. This is important to understand. So there are 2 things that are unique about this program. One is that there are these platoons, and the second is the boards. Let me talk first about the platoons. The platoons are meetings, roughly about 1 hour, the group meetings, with a program staff or executive and the entrepreneurs and 6 peers. So basically think about 7 startups or 7 founders in this meeting where they share experiences, share advice, and talk about whatever they wish to talk about. What we do is we have a treatment and a control platoon. So the difference between these 2 platoons is that the treatment platoon, the executive explicitly asks those 2 questions that I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, right? While the control platoon does not. It's just an open kind of discussion with no structure. The second thing I mentioned about is the boards. These are also 1-hour meetings, but they are between the founder and external mentors. And the program executives also participate in this meeting, but they take a secondary role. It's more about a personal or individual relationship between the founder and a group of board members, if you may. And again, in the boards, we have a treatment and control group. So this is how we set up the design. It's a 2-arm, double-blind, complete block, stratified, randomized control trial. So we managed to work with the program so that they wanted to stratify by industry. So we asked them to stratify, make the stratus big enough so that we had enough of enough people in these strata so that we could actually do an individual level randomization. So given the strata, we individually randomized participants to the treatment or control group, and that's how we created the platoons. Now, if you were in a treatment platoon, you would, by extension, also be in a treatment board. If you were in a control platoon, you would be in a control board, and so forth. So the experiment, this is how we implemented it. We have a series of outcome measures roughly every semester since graduation, where we measure survival, employees, capital raised, revenue, and margin. And we conducted a series of in-depth interviews. And this is important because essentially what we did is we took 22 participants randomly assigned for the treatment and control group. So we took 11 from each group, and we conducted 1-hour semi-structured interviews. And we took these interviews, transcribed them, and had them professionally codified. Obviously blinded from the treatment condition to avoid any biasing. And in effect, we have 122 single-spaced pages of qualitative data. Now, as these interviews were codified, certain codes started emerging, but we took the codes that were more frequent and were able to identify certain categories. And the categories that we identified were positive and critical aspects of boards, positive and critical aspects of platoons, comparison between boards and platoons, and general sentiments towards Startup Chile. So after we counted the code frequency, just then we separated between the treatment and control groups and looked at the results. This slide, I don't expect to go into depth with this slide. It's just a way to show that we had copious notes on the different interventions. So, for example, we counted the number of committed tasks, the number of failed tasks, completed tasks. In the control sessions, there were spontaneous tasks that were not primed. We also counted those, the time in each meeting, etc. Regarding our survey attrition rate, in general, all observables look pretty good. We have a roughly 80% response rate, but there's a few things that I want to draw your attention to. There was a greater likelihood of getting a response from Chilean entrepreneurs and also from smaller companies. Regarding our sample randomization check, again, all observables look relatively good, but I do want to draw your attention to the initial monthly sales and initial employees. So randomly, the control group has higher initial sales and higher employees relative to the treatment group. This is the manipulation check. Essentially, what this shows is that participants did perceive the treatment and also the treatment was correctly implemented. It also shows the number of tasks that were committed to by the treatment group. So on average 3.8 tasks were committed by the treatment group and 1.3 were committed by the control group. So let's look at the quantitative analysis and the results. For each one of these performance measures, we have two models. The model on the left, or all models include controls for generation, executive, initial sales, and employees. And then the model on the right for each one of these measures include additional controls such as gender, education, application score to see if there's some sort of quality effect, and nationality. Capital raised is a dummy if above $100,000. And as you can see here, we find no differences between both groups. Now let's jump into the qualitative analysis. And I just want to point out how we built this. So essentially, if you see the column on the right, you see the weight. And so essentially a positive percentage means that from the frequency of codes that emerge from the interviews, a positive number implies that there were many more, there was a greater frequency of treated participants associated to that code. So you can see, and we're going to discuss this in a minute, but you can see certain patterns emerge. And so, for example, here you see that negative percentages are that the control interviewees were more frequently talking about these other aspects. So let's move on to the discussion. In our view, the experiment was correctly implemented, as seen by the treated participants felt much more committed to execute the tasks, and the number of tasks committed to execute for the treated participants was great. 3 times bigger than for those who were in the control group. Now, when we interview the treated participants, it's interesting to see that the treated participants had more, in general, positive opinions about the utility of the boards and the platoons in terms of the feedback that they got, the networking, the emotional support, etc. They also were critical about the boards and the platoons, but they seem to have more constructive criticism towards the boards and platoons. In other words, it's as if they had higher expectations about the quality and organization. So they liked them, but they would have liked them to have been maybe more organized. And then another interesting thing that emerges is that they appreciate the help of the program to expand internationally, but again felt somewhat burdened by too many obligations, perhaps as a consequence of this supervision and request for executing tasks. In contrast, if we look at the control participants, they were also critical about boards and platoons, but in a different way. They were critical in a negative way, not constructive way. They were critical, and things that emerged were frustration, anxiety, and lack of transparency in the case of the boards, and uselessness and unnatural dialogue in the case of the platoons. And they also found the program too bureaucratic. Now, this is different than too many obligations, which is what emerged from the treated participants. Bureaucratic in the negative sense. So that's also interesting how that emerged. Unexpected results? Well, in general, all participants felt more committed to execute the platoon tasks than the board tasks. And this is clear from the manipulation check and also the interviews. So is there some sort of peer pressure that is occurring? Another interesting, surprising thing is that for the treated interviews, the platoons induced a lower commitment, perhaps because their comparison relative to the control group was the board's structure. So perhaps the boards felt much more structured than the platoons. And then, of course, the no quantitative average treatment effects, which we want to explore further. So just to wrap up, our next steps are the analysis of potential heterogeneous treatment effects, look at more longer-term non-survey measures such as LinkedIn and Crunchbase, and look at and test the treatment intensity, and also explore the type and number of tasks that were committed and completed. And of course, explore any feedback and ideas that you guys can give us. So thank you so much for this opportunity, and I look forward to your thoughts.